Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's an honor. It's an honor to be able to speak with you here today. Yeah, so I will launch into a few minutes just talking about my role, what I do for the UN, my department. I'm actually not going to go into like specific, like what are our official missions and values and things like that kind of stuff. You can look up on the website later on. I'm much more interested in giving you my personal perspective on the UN, my department, and what I do. Please do ask questions. I don't mind if you interrupt actually, and ask as we're going along. Type into the chat, raise your hand. I would like this to be as interactive as possible. So yeah, what do I do? So I'm the security advisor for the United Nations here in Kazakhstan. What does that mean? Here in Kazakhstan, we have about 110 international staff working for the UN and about 550 national colleagues working for the UN here. And my job is basically to make sure that they're safe. How do I do that? We follow a principle called security risk management. And that basically involves looking at an environment, take Kazakhstan, for example, and identifying the threats in that environment. What are the potential things that could harm us in that environment? What is our vulnerability to those threats? That's what risk is. And then to make suggestions, recommendations on ways to manage that risk. So threat and risk analysis, recommendations, that's the concept of risk management. So that's the fundamental principle to my job, my role as a security advisor. Now you might say that, oh, Kazakhstan's pretty safe, it's pretty stable. So then what do I do here? Yeah, it's true. On the one hand, Kazakhstan is relatively safe and relatively stable, but there are always threats and risks in any environment. And my job is to identify what those are. And they might not be the obvious ones, right? They could be anything from a strategic political instability to crime, to even environmental risks. In Almaty, for example, there's the risk from earthquake, as a natural hazard. So that's something that falls within the scope of safety and security as well. But it's true, Kazakhstan is relatively safe and secure. My point of view. I've worked in other countries that are on the other end of the scale. I used to work in Yemen, for example, and that's obviously beset by civil war, and there's a lot of chaos going on there. But the principle of my job is the same. It's the same thing, right? If, for example, you were a humanitarian, maybe you're working for UNICEF, and you want to go out and deliver vaccines to children in a village in Yemen, my job would be the same sort of principle of security risk management. I would look at what the threats and risks are for that particular mission, where you want to go, what you want to do. Maybe you have to cross a front line. Maybe there's a risk of airstrikes, a risk of kidnap. Maybe the people in the village don't even like you. So that's a risk in itself. And if you really, really want to go to that village, then we would figure out ways to be able to do that as safely as possible. Go in an armored vehicle, go in a convoy, get an escort from the government, maybe talk to the bad guys, along those lines. So that's, as a security advisor in the United Nations, that's my role. So I'm an advisor to the United Nations. In that sense, trying to make sure that the humanitarians, the specialists, the diplomats, all of those people that they're as safe as and secure as possible. The department I work for a department called UNDSS, which is the United Nations Department for Safety and Security. And my department is part of the UN Secretariat. So hopefully all of you know the Secretariat is that big famous building in New York, right? UN headquarters, where they have the General Assembly, the Security Council, ambassadors to the UN, and all that kind of stuff. So that's my headquarters, that building in New York. Again, hopefully you know that there are many agencies and organizations and offices that are within the UN system, but that are not necessarily part of that secretariat. For example, there's UNICEF, the Agency for Children, WHO for Health, UNHCR for Refugees, so on and so on. Even some of the financial institutions like the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on, they are all within the UN system as well. They are not part of the Secretariat. Their headquarters is not that building in New York. They have their own headquarters in different parts of the world. So if you're someone like me, a security professional in the UN system, you could either work for one of these organizations, one of these agencies directly as a security professional. And that's what I used to do when I was in Yemen. I was a security professional for UNICEF specifically. Or you could work for my department at the secretariat level, which is a sort of higher, more strategic coordination level, and do what I do. So, for example, here in Kazakhstan, there are almost 30 different agencies that are UN agencies working here in Kazakhstan. And I think over the last few days, you've been meeting my colleagues from some of those agencies. So those are the different, because of that structure of the UN, you could be a security professional, like I said, working for one of those agencies directly, or working for the Secretariat. And the Secretariat and each agency, they have different sort of recruitment strategies, recruitment processes, and so on, because they're different entities. Let me take a pause there and try to introduce some of this discussion interactivity. Any questions, comments, things you want me to expand on in terms of what I do?
Yes, there is a question in chat box.
Yeah, I see one in the chat. Yeah, thanks very much. Were any extra security measures imposed during the January unrest? If yes, what were they? That's a great question. Okay, so this goes back to what I was saying about Kazakhstan being, relatively safe, relatively stable. There's always the risk of something happening, and we saw that in January. And January is the perfect example for that. All right. We don't have that kind of unrest every day here in Kazakhstan, and that's where we're lucky. But the potential for that, something like that to occur is always there. It occurred in January, and those are the situations, the crises that we need to that I spend my day job preparing for. Right. I'll be quite honest with you here, because that's what I want to do. Because I mean, whatever happened in January was a surprise to everyone. It was unprecedented here in Kazakhstan, right? At the scale of that unrest, and it caught many people by surprise. With hindsight, you can say it was, there was you can reason, you can come up with reasons that the reasons for why it occurred. But like I said, it was an unprecedented set of events. Because Kazakhstan had enjoyed 30 odd years of stability, this is the issue that we're constantly having to deal with in security, is that when nothing happens, people become complacent. And so you spend a lot of time putting in measures, these recommendations that I talked about to manage risk. And if you're doing that well, then nothing should happen. It should be nice and quiet, right? And security is one of those weird areas where if it is nice and quiet and you don't look busy, it means that you're doing a good job. So what happened in January? When January occurred, we discovered that we weren't as prepared as we could have been, because we had enjoyed so many years of stability and calm. I started here in Kazakhstan a year ago, by the way. So, that's just years and years worth of people coming in, enjoying like a nice stable period, and then moving on. So let's go to the question specifically. Were any extra security measures imposed during the January 5th event? Not really. Nothing, not in the sense of extra security measures. The situation in January was, the biggest thing we had to deal with was a communication issue, right? How we lost communications with everybody. I was here in the capital at the time. Half of our UN footprint is in Almaty, and so trying to understand what was going on, who was where in the city, who was close to the unrest, who was a little bit further away, and a little bit more safe. That was really the challenge during that period. What did we do to manage the risk at the time? We did what pretty much everybody else did, and advised our staff to what we call shelter in place. So wherever they were, and most people were home at the time, all we could recommend, all we could suggest was just stay where you are. And that's easier said than done, right? Because there are many people who were the riots were outside their front door. They were scared that somebody might come into their building, or maybe they were running out of food, running out of medicine at home, things that were just generally getting anxious and restless. So our response during that January crisis was shelter in place, and then basically we were just doing as much as possible to manage those people who were sheltering in place and making sure that they were okay. I was quite happy to learn afterwards, after January, and when we're all in that sort of period of lessons learned and what did other people do, how did other international missions, diplomatic missions respond. I was quite happy to learn that everybody else responded in the same way. Everybody else had the same challenges with communications. Everybody else had the same challenges with sheltering in place and staying at home. It also highlighted, January also highlighted some of those plans and preparations that I spend my day, the rest of the year, trying to tell people this is how we can manage risk in the future. It highlighted where people become complacent with that. So, for example, one of the very standard things that we recommend to our personnel is, in your home, have enough food to last you for a week. Have emergency, if you take medication, have emergency medication at home, have cash on reserve at home, things like that, so that if you do have to shelter in place for a few days, then running out of food is not one of the things that you have to worry about. And some people were prepared in that sense, and some people were less prepared in that sense. So, the January events were, they were unfortunate, of course, but it really reminded everybody about the importance of security and how important preparedness in the quiet periods, in the normal days, that is important, right? Security doesn't just exist during unrest. The important part of security is done on days like this, where it's nice and sunny and nice and peaceful outside. Does that answer your question? Happy to expand more on that if you want.
Janar, is it an answer of your question? Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Jana. Okay. No. Okay. There's a question here. What do you? Okay. So I'll read out the question. What do you think about leaving? What do you think about Kazakhstan leaving their CSTO? Is it possible for Kazakhstan to replace CSTO with US partnership in order to solve the security dilemma in Central Asia? This is a good question. So first of all, let me make a bit of a disclaimer here. This question is completely outside of my mandate, right? So where I am a security advisor, like I mentioned, my job is to it's inward facing, right? My job is to look after the safety and security of the UN itself. I don't get involved in strategic international security, which is what this question is along the lines of, right? The Collective Security Treaty Organization and whether Kazakhstan should be in it or should not. That is, so first of all, that's a question that's outside of my mandate. So any answer that I give to this question is going to be my own opinion, right? And not an official one. What do I think about it? Is it possible for Kazakhstan to replace the CSTO with US partnership in order to solve the security dilemma in Asia? Well, first of all, I would say yes, it would be it's possible. It's possible, of course, it's possible, because Kazakhstan can choose whether to stay in CSTO or not. The question is, what would the consequences be of making such a decision? And then you say, in order to solve the security dilemma in Central Asia, what is the security dilemma in Asia? You sort of need to articulate that particular problem more. It's a very good question, but it's really quite a complicated one that I would be reluctant. I would love for us to sit around a table and discuss this, but it's not a question that I can get into in this particular sort of career day kind of scenario. But please, for me, I don't want this to be a one-off kind of event. So I'll happily share my contact details afterwards. I'm in Almaty on a regular basis. I would love to come by the university and for us as a group to sit down and talk about some of these more strategic, geopolitical questions in person. From the UN perspective, what country is the most dangerous to work in, and what security measures are taken to protect UN in these places? This is a good question. Okay. So what we do in the UN, in fact, all diplomatic missions, international organizations do this to some extent, is we characterize, first of all, we refer to where we're located as our duty station, right? So my duty station is Kazakhstan as a country. More specifically, my duty station is Nur Sultan, the capital here, as the city. And what the UN does is it categorizes all the different duty stations around the world in terms of hardship. Now, hardship, and it ranges from HQ level duty stations like New York, Vienna, Nairobi, Geneva, Rome. These are headquarter duty stations. Then we get something like an A duty station. Kazakhstan actually is an A duty station. London, many places in Europe, these will be A duty stations. And then it goes all the way down to what we call E duty stations, emergency duty stations. And at that end of the scale, there would be places like Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, all of those chaotic places that you might expect. This is a hardship scale. Hardship is not quite, it's linked to security, but it's not quite the same thing. So for example, if Kazakhstan did not have functioning, if the local services here in Kazakhstan were not as good as they are, for example, access to healthcare, government services, public services, infrastructure, transport, the ability, like food on the shelves in the supermarket. If all of those things were not at the level that they are here in Kazakhstan, even without a war, even without security issues, then we could make an argument that the hardship level for Kazakhstan should be different. So there's a hardship. We look at things in terms of hardship on the one hand. On the other hand, we do have specific security levels for each country. We look at each country in terms of security level. And that ranges from level 1, which we call minimal, all the way up to level 5, I think it is, which is extreme. And your security level is comprised of what I said earlier, this idea of threat and risk assessment. So in the UN, we use 5 categories of threat: armed conflict, terrorism, crime, civil unrest, and the 5th one is natural hazards. And so we will look at a country, we will look at a particular environment, and we will analyze and make our assessment of the threat levels for each one of those categories, our risk, our exposure to those threats under each one of those categories, and then come up with, there's an algorithm involved, there's a lot of sort of hidden mathematics involved, that will then generate an overall security level for that particular country. Kazakhstan, for example, is low overall, our level, our security level here. But at the other end of the scale, on level 5, you're going to have places like Yemen. The places are the typical places I mentioned: Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, and so on. So to go back to your original question, from the UN perspective, what country is the most dangerous to work? It's not one specific country, but we do have a number of countries that are at level 5, at that particular scale, right? There is something beyond level 5, and that's what we call under evacuation status. And this can apply to, let's say, let's take Afghanistan last year, right, when the Taliban took over the country. For a very short period, we evacuated a number of personnel from Afghanistan, and in fact, some of them came here to Almaty. And so that period was so our security level goes to a point where we want to reduce the number of people in country. We actually now don't ever. We're sort of guided by a principle that we would never evacuate a country completely of UN personnel. The last time that happened was in Yemen, actually, just before I was there. So in 2015, March 2015, when the current conflict in Yemen started, and the Saudi-led coalition started conducting airstrikes across the country, the UN and other embassies evacuated Yemen completely, down to zero. So Yemen was under evacuation status. And over the next few months, we slowly started coming back and increasing, putting our footprint back into Yemen, and that was when I started there. So that was the last time that the UN fully evacuated any country. The situation in Afghanistan last year, we evacuated some people, but we deliberately left some people behind. Ukraine, someone's asking about Ukraine now. What's the situation in Ukraine? Same sort of principle, actually. So when the current situation in Ukraine started, some UN personnel were evacuated from parts of Ukraine. So Ukraine itself as a country was not under evacuation status, but certain cities within it were. And so people were either evacuated out of the country or relocated to other cities within Ukraine. So this entire time we have had UN personnel on the ground in Ukraine, but maybe just relocated to another city. So what is the security level for Ukraine now? It depends on the city, on which part of Ukraine. Some parts of Ukraine are still under evacuation status. Other parts are under not even level 5. Some of them are still under level 4, or it depends. What are some of the other questions here? Okay, I'm going to jump over one question and then come back to the other one, because this next question is also related to supporting Ukraine. Are any UN departments of Kazakhstan involved in supporting Ukraine? Yes, in one form or another. So the UN presence in a country, let's take Kazakhstan, for example. I mentioned earlier that we've got almost 30 different organizations, agencies, offices here in Kazakhstan. Now, many of those offices are what we call country offices. And so they are working specifically for the development of Kazakhstan. Now, there are some agencies and some branches of agencies that are located here in Kazakhstan that have a regional portfolio. And quite often, typically, these regional offices, they're based in Almaty, and they typically look at Central Asia. So it might be an UNHCR, for example. There's no refugee crisis here in Kazakhstan, but there are refugees in the region. And so our UNHCR office in Almaty has a regional portfolio. So are any UN departments of Kazakhstan involved in supporting Ukraine? Yes, so some of those agencies that have regional offices here that reach as far as Ukraine are supporting those directly. The other way in which the UN in Kazakhstan is supporting Ukraine is actually sending people there physically. In fact, one of my colleagues, I have a very small team. I have one national colleague who works for me here in Nur Sultan, and one colleague who's based in Almaty. And my colleague in Marty is not in Ukraine right now, but in Belarus next door, supporting the situation in Ukraine. So we send people on what we call surge missions to respond to a crisis that's happening somewhere else in the world. We will redeploy personnel for short periods on these surge missions to help support. And then the other way in which the situation in Ukraine is impacting the UN in Kazakhstan is all of those sort of indirect effects as well, right? So, we look at what might the situation in Ukraine create for us here in the Central Asia region, and guess in Kazakhstan specifically, and we try to try to figure that out. So I hope that answers that question. Can a student of the second course, a second year student in international relations, apply for an internship in security in the UN? I would like to be able to offer you internships directly at my level. And that is genuinely something that I'm trying to work on. It's very tricky because I work for the Secretariat. Because my headquarters is in New York, internships are then managed at that central level. So we do have interns in the security department in the UN, but they are usually at the New York headquarters level. So what you can do is go to the UN website, un.org, and navigate your way to there's a specifics page on internships actually. So you can navigate your way to the page on internships and find out more information from there. But that is that's at the moment the only way to sort of look at it. So go to the UN website, search for internships, and you can find out more information from there. In the meantime, like I said, I am trying to personally find a way to be able to recruit interns directly into my office here at the country level. That's something I'm working on. That's why I'm very happy to have a partnership with a university like yours going forward. So maybe we can work something out there. So at the moment it's tricky, but it's something we're working on. Internships in security. What do you like most about your work? That's a funny question. Again, I'm going to be brutally honest here. I'm often more honest when I speak to students than some of my colleagues are. My day-to-day work is not that exciting, right? It's office-based and it comes with all of the stresses, the frustrations of any office-based job, right? And that's not just here in Kazakhstan, that's just as much in places like Yemen or Afghanistan or these other, extreme duty stations. When I thing in these environments is the office-based part of it. The office-based culture, the office-based bureaucracy, administration, politics, that exists in any organization, and I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't exist in the UN. So on a day-to-day basis, at that sort of level, my job is not terribly exciting, right? But that's not the question. The question is, what do I like most about my work? The question, what do I like most about my work, is the fact that I do work for the UN. The UN is a global organization. It is unique. It is the only global organization at the scale that it is, and that does the thing that does the things that it does. And what I like most about my work are the opportunities that working for the UN gives you. So the opportunities to go to places and work in places like Yemen, to work in places like Kazakhstan, even, and the other countries that I've been in as well. Each one of the places that I've worked in has been a country that I probably would not have worked in or even traveled to otherwise. And so that's what I enjoy most about my work is the experience of the world that it gives me. If you work in a state with a high level of security alert, such as Afghanistan or Yemen, where do you stay or live? Hotel or UN-owned building? Another great question. So typically it's in a compound. So I talked about earlier the idea of hardship duty stations, sort of linked to duty stations with a high security level. Part of that whole classification would be whether or not the duty station is a family duty station or a non-family duty station. So somewhere like New York or London, well, not London because the UN doesn't really operate in the UK, but somewhere like New York or Nairobi, or even Kazakhstan. I used to work in Jordan as well. These are all family duty stations. So when it's a family duty station, it means that you can move to that duty station with your family and you find your own place to live. When I moved here in Kazakhstan, I found this apartment that I'm living in, and I live. You live out in the community as it were. Now, if it is a non-family duty station, because of the high level of security or because of the hardship, you typically have a sort of UN compound or a series of compounds where you would live. So Yemen, for example, I mentioned in early 2015 when the current war started, everybody evacuated. Up until that point, the UN colleagues in Yemen were living in their own houses. They had their own houses, scattered throughout the city, but then everybody evacuated. When we came back after the evacuation, we all moved into a secure hotel, and then it became that became a UN compound. And the UN compound becomes then self-sufficient with accommodation, catering, and living facilities. So yeah, so that's I hope that answers your question there. So if you're on a high level sort of country, yes, like a compound, maybe in an apartment complex, you put a perimeter around it, you put guards around it, and you might live in a series of apartments, but it's a compound. Can you give us some insight regarding Iran? For now, Kazakhstan is looking for new seaports besides Russia. If we cooperate more with Iran in terms of trade, renting seaports, how will these actions affect the Kazakh-Western relationship? It's an interesting question. Unfortunately, that's sort of similar to the CSTO question, where it's a geopolitical question that I can't really answer. And I can't answer it for two reasons. One, it's outside my mandate. And two, I actually don't know anything about the relationship with Iran, to be quite honest. because it's not something that I look at. It's not a country that I've been to, and on a day-to-day basis, my job doesn't involve that kind of strategic geopolitical analysis. So, great question. I'm afraid I can't answer it, to be honest. Is it true that after working for 5 years in the UN, you can receive a pension in any country in the world? Yes. So after 5 years, and I think it has to be 5 years continuous service. But yeah, it's true. After 5 years working in the UN, you can then receive a pension. One of the issues with the UN is that there are so many different contracts, different types of contracts, different ways that you can be employed by the UN. Everything from being a full-time, being on a full-time fixed-term contract, like a sort of full staff member, which I am, for example. At the other end of the scale, you might have interns, for instance. But the UN is full of consultants, full of people on short-term contracts, rotating contracts, service contracts, and a whole bunch of HR sort of terminology that confuses even me. But yes, if you're on a particular type of fixed-term contract, you're then eligible, or you then contribute to a pension scheme. The UN has quite a good pension scheme. And after 5 years, it becomes viable. You can receive a pension in any country in the world. I actually don't know how the pension pays out. But what I do know is that working for the UN does come with these kinds of benefits. The UN is, it's that sort of classic argument, which I think you might be familiar with already. If you're working in the public sector in your country versus the private sector. If you work in the private sector, and this is in any country, if you work in the private sector, your salary might be higher, but your benefits are less. If you work in the public sector, your salary is typically lower, but you get more benefits, more holidays, maybe support for education, maybe healthcare is included, and then things like your pension and social security and national insurance and things like that. The UN is an international civil service. And so the benefits, those sort of intangible benefits like education grants for your children, health insurance, the pension scheme, all of those are quite good in the UN. So if you do have a long career in the UN, you are rewarded with these benefits like a pension. How it pays out in any country in the world, I'm not quite sure. What are the best and worst parts of working for the organization? I've kind of touched upon this already, actually. So what are some of the good parts? Like I just said, those benefits, right? Pension benefits, insurance, if you have a family, education grants for your children and things like that. Those are good things. And then also, for me, the best thing about working for the UN is like I said earlier, those opportunities, the opportunity to work in different countries, to work in environments that you would not otherwise be able to access in many cases, and to meet new people and new nationalities and so on. That is, for me, that's easily the best thing working for the UN. What are some of the worst things about working for the UN? Again, I mentioned this already. The bureaucracy, the inefficiencies, the administration, the processes, all of those cliches about the UN being slow and inefficient, they're all true, unfortunately. And you know, it's sort of inevitable. Any organization, any company, once it gets beyond a certain size, bureaucracy and administration and inefficiencies are naturally going to evolve as part of that organization. And then you look at the scale of the UN, how long it's been around and how big it is. You know, that bureaucracy and inefficiency is on a massive scale. That's the worst part about working for the organization. Does the UN need graduate journalism students? If yes, at what workplace could they get a job? Yes, is the answer. And the reason is the UN, a big part of what the UN does is communications. And I think one of my colleagues from the Department for Global Communications had one of these sessions the other day. But each one of those agencies, the Secretariat first of all, but then each one of those agencies that I talked about, those individual agencies like UNICEF, everyone from UNICEF to the World Bank to whomever, will have media specialists, communication specialists, spokespersons, not just for interacting with external audiences, including the media, but also for interacting with populations, beneficiaries, partners, donors. So there's a lot of that sort of, there's a lot of scope for specialists in journalism and communications. Information, you know, there's how the UN sort of manages itself in terms of media is also a huge thing. So yes, there is a need for journalism, people with a journalism background. At what workplace could they get a job? All department, every organization in the UN needs someone who's good at communications. But I would look at, as a starting point, the Department for Global Communications, which was my colleague Vlastimil had one of these sessions the other day. So have a look at them. Do UN workers, I see someone's hand up and I'll come to you
Yes.
in a second.
Arman,
Yeah,
unmute.
let's do that and then I'll come back to the other questions in the chat.
Arman. Where is Arman? He's disappeared.
He disappeared?
Yes, I suppose.
Okay. Well, let me go back to some of the other questions.
Mm-hmm.
Do UN workers have some kind of privileges and immunities in countries as diplomats do? Very good question as well. The answer is yes, in some form or another. So there is actually, maybe you've heard of the Charter, the United Nations and the Vienna Convention and all this kind of stuff. So there's a whole convention on privileges and immunities for officials of the UN. What it boils down to is this. Above a certain rank in the UN, you are treated as a diplomat, as an individual, and so that means as an individual, you have privileges and immunities as an individual. So, for example, it's typically at the level of a head of agency. So the head of the representative of UNICEF in Kazakhstan, for example, will be at that sufficient rank to get those privileges and immunities as an individual, as a diplomat. The person who oversees the UN at the country level is called the resident coordinator. Here in Kazakhstan, her name's Michaela. So she's the equivalent of our ambassador, if you like. And so she certainly has, you know, privileges and immunities as an individual, as a diplomat. So beyond a certain rank, you're like an individual diplomat. You're like an individual diplomat. For everybody else, for other officials who work for the UN, both nationals and internationals, we have what is called functional immunity. So that means that we enjoy privileges and immunities when we are on official duty and carrying out official functions. So yeah, so yes is the answer to your question. Do UN workers have some kind of privileges and immunities in countries that diplomats do? The answer is yes, generally. But the level of privileges and immunities can vary. We also have what we call a UNLP, a UN laissez-passer, which is a UN passport that is in addition to our own national passport. So when we're on official duty or officially traveling, we can travel with a UN passport that can get us, it can overcome some visa restrictions and things like that. Was it difficult to apply for work in the UN? Yes, unfortunately, it was. And it still is. I talked about bureaucracy and inefficiencies and all of those criticisms of the UN. Those very much apply to recruitment in the UN. When I was at university and when I was studying international relations, I applied to the UN for years and didn't get anywhere. I would never hear back from them. Ironically, the way I got into the UN is I was recruited by the UN when I wasn't looking. I was working in the private security sector, and then a recruiter who had been hired by UNICEF actually found me, and then I got into a talent pool, and then I was recruited out of a talent pool. So yes, it is difficult to apply for. It's difficult to apply for a specific vacancy, a specific job in the UN as an external candidate. The best ways to get into the UN are through schemes like internships. The UN Volunteers Program is a very good program, a very good way for people to get in. And there are also, have a look at, because countries will also, member states will also have programs like the Junior Professional Officer Program. So this is where a member state, a country, will sponsor some of its own nationals to go and work for the UN. So these are really good ways for getting into the UN. What are the criteria for applying to the UN related to the previous question? So if you want to work at the international level within the UN, you need at least a master's degree. So do focus on getting at least a graduate degree, a master's degree, and then the other aspect of your profile to focus on is languages. Just keep up your languages, your language skills. That's one of the most valuable assets you can have in the UN. What would you recommend for graduate degrees in journalism to enter the organization? Are there any entering positions? How are they called? I talked about this already a little bit. People with a journalism background. Yeah, there's a lot of work is related to communications in the UN. Spokespersons, media specialists, and almost every organization and department will have an interest in someone with communication skills. Are there any entering positions and how are they called? You just need to you need to explore. So when you're looking for jobs and schemes and ways to enter the UN, if you go to the UN website, UN.org, and start poking around there, remember that really only refers to the Secretariat. But there are all of these other organizations that are part of the UN as well, and each one of those will have their own website and their own schemes, their own talent pools, their own recruitment campaigns. So you will have to find the UNICEF website. You'll have to go to the website for the World Bank. You'll have to go to the website for the Department for Outer Space Affairs, the Department for the UN University. So there's so much you have to explore, really. Yeah, but don't just get caught up on the UN website because each organization will have their own place where you need to look. And look for some of these recruitment campaigns, right? Some of these talent pools and things like that. Those are good things to apply for. What criteria do you set when hiring an employee with a small amount of work experience? I mean, for me, if I'm speaking on behalf of my department is full of security professionals. And these are people like myself who have typically had military careers, police careers, and things like that. So that's speaking on behalf of my department. My department needs to evolve. It needs younger people. It needs to get out of this mindset that only people who have been in the military or been in the police, that only those people can do security. That's not the case. But it needs to get better. The other agencies, or where if you're applying into different sort of fields apart from security, then you can make up qualifications and other things where you don't have so much work experience. My personal advice to you would be to be as diverse as possible. When you're starting your career, don't do the things that you think will get you hired by the UN. Do the things that you're interested in, and work for different companies, different organizations, different sectors, public sector, private sector. Just do the things that you enjoy, and then when the time is right, the UN will find you, right? If you keep in touch with it. Have I served in the military? Yes. So I'm not a career military person. I didn't do like 20 years in the military or anything like that. But I was in the British Army for a number of years as an intelligence analyst. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I think I got to the end of the questions in the chat.
Yes, our session is almost over.
Yeah, please. So Elmira, let me hand it back to you then to moderate the sort of where we are.
If our students have any more questions and you have extra minutes to answer.
Yeah, I can stay around for a little bit more. Yeah.
Hi guys, yes. Do you have any questions? Thank you. No questions anymore. Well, Justine, thank you very much for your talk, for your comprehensive discussion and answers. Thank you guys for joining us. If you have more questions, you can address to my email and I will forward to Justine. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you to all of you. I really enjoyed these opportunities to speak to people like yourselves and universities like you guys. I've got quite an academic background myself, and so I'm reconnecting with that now here in Kazakhstan.